Firefighters have a number of opportunities to aid in the investigation of a fire. One step they may take is to help preserve evidence. But in order to do this, the firefighter must first be able to recognize the evidence.
My name is Scott Doherty. I'm a captain at the New Hampshire Fire Academy. I run the inspector, instructor, and investigator programs for the Academy. Prior to that, I was a deputy chief for the City of Schenectady, New York Fire Department. There I started as a firefighter, worked my way up through the ranks, became a deputy chief, and investigated fires for about 15 years. For about the last 4 years, I was in charge of the Fire Investigation Bureau. The actions of the firefighter could help the investigator in many ways. We had an arson fire. The arsonist actually had set 6 different points of ignition within a residence. So as the firefighters were going in to put the fire out, he had a very particular method. He had actually taped accelerants to rolls of paper towels, and they found 6 different rolls of paper towels throughout the residence. So their initial observations were really the key to helping us keep that evidence secure and certainly ultimately getting conviction for arson in that fire.
With a fire scene examination, we're usually working from the areas of least damage towards the areas of most damage. At the very end of that, if we're able to identify it, that's where we will find our point of origin, unless there are multiple points of origin in a structure. That's something that we're going to be looking at and documenting very closely. And from a firefighter perspective, that's an area that they should be very careful. If there's no immediate need for fire suppression in that area, it's very, very important for that area to be preserved. Perhaps you have a couch that was up against the wall. Maybe there's a pattern on the wall, something that brings a person back to this one area where they can say, wow, it looks like there was a lot of fire activity in this one area that may be spread elsewhere. Sometimes you can go into a fire scene and even a line firefighter that has no training in fire investigation can look at something and it will be fairly obvious or stand out to them. Obviously, if there's fire in that area and the fire needs to be extinguished, or if a rescue needs to be effected, or there's some hazard to life or property that needs to be addressed, that takes priority. The only thing that I would caution against with respect to the fire service and suppression is if we're in an overhaul phase and there's some overhaul work being done in and around the fire origin area or what they believe might be the point of origin, tread very carefully and try and preserve that if possible. A lot of people would characterize that quickly as saying, oh, that must be where the fire started. That's not necessarily true. That could be where a large fuel load was. That could be where perhaps there was some kind of large plastic item, or perhaps even there could have been an ignitable liquid introduced to that area. That could cause a significant area of damage, even more significant than where the fire originated from. This could also be caused by a ventilation point where you have an oxygen-deprived fire and there's a window that's open. The fire is going to communicate to where the fire triangle really comes together the best. If there's only one source of fresh air, you might have the most of that fire damage after the fire develops for a period of time be away from the area of origin and over in towards the window or over towards the fuel load or a different area. So it's an important area to preserve if possible, because oftentimes the area of most damage will be where the fire originated, but that's not always the case. It's from an investigative perspective, it's something that we really want to look at closely, but we don't definitively look at that and make the conclusion, yes, that's where the fire always started, because that's not always the case. Depth of char indicates to us that there was generally either a greater time exposure or greater heat intensity on a given item. A really good thing that we do in fire investigations that can help us is if we can find structural members of a building, perhaps a fire that's gone into post-flashover. They can be very hard to investigate. What we can look at sometimes are the 2x4s behind the walls. Let's say the sheetrock has failed, and we now have some charring that's on these wooden structures behind the walls. We can compare one to the other and we can say, all right, does this one have more depth of charring on it? Has this one had more mass loss? Is there less of this material that's remaining? We can use that to actually help steer us towards how this fire communicated through a structure, where fuel loads were, and perhaps even where the fire occurred. Different burn patterns that could be observed, generally we're seeing them on common substrates. It could be on concrete, they could be on gypsum wallboard that's been preserved and hasn't failed because of the fire. It could happen on a number of different materials. You could have an inverted cone pattern, which could potentially be a sign that we had a small fire in an area that started to develop but didn't actually get into a phase where it was burning in greater capacity. Perhaps it ran out of fuel, perhaps it didn't fully develop because the fresh air, left the area, the oxygen wasn't available to sustain combustion. We can have V patterns, which can be indicative of fire perhaps originating in an area or fuel load being in an area. Generally, when we see these patterns, they're either on a floor surface or on a wall or on a ceiling. It's always important for a fire investigator to look up and look all around them, look at the floor, examine an area, try and remove anything that we can to be able to establish, all right, what are the protected areas? What are some of these patterns that we're using to analyze our fire origin and cause investigation?
Firefighters can preserve evidence in several different ways. Probably one of the most important ways is to not use too much water during suppression activities. Obviously, you've got to use enough water to completely put the fire out, but if you can sparingly use water once you've got the fire out, it can help preserve evidence in that regard. The current practice of using straight streams can be harmful in terms of destroying evidence. So certainly I would encourage any crew to follow the department's protocols as far as the use of straight streams. But once you get to the overhaul phase, that may be a time to think about using fog nozzles and using a little wider cone with a little gentler, if you will, pattern. And just when you're making sure that the fire's out, being careful to not destroy objects at that point that could be key to an investigation. The use of gasoline-powered equipment can be a huge detriment to investigators, and I'll give you a couple of examples. The use of gasoline-powered generators used to be very common at fire scenes. Before we had LED lights and things that drew relatively low amounts of current, we had to use generators to power lights and things like that. The problem with using gasoline-powered equipment is that you could get leaks of both gasoline and oil into a scene, so they can contaminate your scene. And certainly if you get a defense attorney that's worth his or her salt, they may pick up on that from your photographs and from questioning and use that potentially against you in court. The other way that it can be harmful is it can actually, in some cases, introduce carbon monoxide into a scene. I've been to a couple of different scenes where people used gasoline-powered generators and ended up giving everybody at the scene mild CO poisoning. Firefighters can cause evidence to be contaminated carrying things like petrochemicals in on their boots, and that's where it's important that, certainly in terms of cancer awareness, we now know that we should be cleaning our gear after every call. So hopefully you've arrived at that fire scene with clean, uncontaminated gear. But you've got to be careful about perhaps walking through gasoline or oil, carrying that into the fire scene. Moving objects from one place to another is another way, unfortunately, that a scene can be contaminated. If firefighters, through the best of intentions, move objects from one place to another, that can sometimes cause great confusion for fire investigators.